Back in 2005, UFC commentator Joe Rogan nearly wound up fighting actor Wesley Snipes. Unfortunately for MMA fans, this never materialised and has resulted in lots of speculation as to how the fight would actually go. Whilst a lot of people are aware of Rogan's martial arts background, far less are knowledgeable about the fighting style of Wesley Snipes. So, what exactly happened and how did it nearly go down? These days, Joe Rogan is a huge celebrity and literally has the most popular podcast in the world. Back in 2005, he was known as a UFC commentator and host of Fear Factor. Aside from this, little else was publicly known about him. Remember, back in 2005, social media was still in its infancy and personal information just wasn't as easily available. During a Wesley Snipes interview, Snipes claimed that he would be down to fighting celebrities in MMA, including Joe Rogan. After this, Rogan responded and claimed he was ready for a fight. Negotiations genuinely followed for a pay-per-view MMA fight, and eventually Snipes backed out just before the fight was signed. The following year, Snipes would get investigated for tax fraud by the IRS. Some argue that this was his true financial motive for fighting. Regardless, as he now had bigger fish to fry, this may have been the reason for cancelling the fight. After this saga, he was eventually jailed for over 2 years. As Joe Rogan has quite an audience these days, he has spoken about his Wesley Snipes drama a few times on his podcast. He was quoted as saying, "So I was like, okay, let's just see what happens. So then there was a bunch of changes to the contract and it was supposed to be 50-50, then it changed and I said okay to that too. I said whatever, let's just do it, let's just do it. I was already a brown belt by then, and I knew what happened when a brown belt fights a white belt. I'm going to get hold of him, and I'm going to squeeze the out of him, and they're going to give me a lot of money, and he's probably not even going to get hurt. That's what I thought." Since the incident, Snipes hasn't really commented on the scenario, and now lives quite a private life. As he's now paid the IRS his debt and is older, he lives a quiet lifestyle and isn't involved in the public eye as much. Having said this, there's clearly no resentment between the two, and it seemed to be a purely professional arrangement. In fact, Snipes was also in talks with the UFC to have a separate celebrity fight against Jean-Claude Van Damme. Of course, the Joe Rogan fight seemed to genuinely gain traction at one point. So, who would win between Joe Rogan and Wesley Snipes? These days, Joe Rogan is in his mid-50s, while Snipes is over 60 years old. For those wondering, this fight is never going to happen. However, the potential fight would have happened over 15 years ago. In other words, Rogan would have been in his early 40s, while Snipes would have been around 45. Basically, it's not like any of the fighters involved would have had an age advantage over the other. In terms of Joe Rogan's positives going into the fight, he was a Taekwondo black belt and regional champion, as well as being a BJJ brown belt. In other words, he was a well-rounded fighter who had seriously trained martial arts in both striking and grappling disciplines. This differs from Wesley Snipes, who was also a martial artist but proficient in different styles. At the time, Snipes was a Shotokan karate and Taekwondo black belt. In short, Snipes was clearly skilled at striking martial arts without knowing any grappling. Ironically, since then, he has trained BJJ, but this was years later. Obviously, in a fight, anything can happen. Even when a fighter has the odds completely in their favour, they can still lose by a single punch. With this said, Snipes would certainly have a puncher's chance, and it may not be as dominant for Rogan as fans believed. Coupled with his striking background, you would be foolish to completely rule out Snipes. Still, the biggest chance of victory would still be firmly in the hands of Joe Rogan. By and large, it's fair to assume that his striking would be superior to Snipes' striking anyway. Although they're both black belts, there's a difference between a competitor, Joe Rogan, and more of a hobbyist, Wesley Snipes. Aside from this, Joe Rogan is also a far superior grappler. As said in interviews, Rogan could have easily taken Snipes down and eventually submitted him. Being a brown belt at the time, this would have been relatively easy against an untrained grappler, so the vast majority of the time, Joe Rogan would win the fight easily against Wesley Snipes. Although this potential fight would be huge today, it nearly took place in a different era when less eyes were on MMA, or Joe Rogan for that matter. This means that it may have flown under the radar somewhat. Unfortunately, it never happened, and since then it's become nothing more than a talking point about a certain part of fighting history. So overall, it's fair to assume that Wesley Snipes did genuinely want to fight Rogan at one point due to his financial issues. However, it also makes sense that after hearing that Joe Rogan wasn't a regular celebrity and had years of combat experience, this caused Snipes to eventually back down. Sadly though, we'll never know the real truth.